Funding for This Is Nashville comes from you, our listeners, and Music City Prep Clinic, Nashville-based provider for PrEP and offering comprehensive sexual health services in an environment designed to be safe, professional, and shame-free. Learn more at musiccityprep.org.
I'm Khalil Ekulona, and this is Nashville. When state representatives Justin Jones and Justin J. Pearson were expelled from the State House for violating decorum, people in Nashville, Tennessee, and the rest of the country took notice. Many were appalled. Some called it undemocratic and even fascist. However shocking, it was not the first attempt at quieting African-American political power. Not even close. That has been happening for decades. MTSU political science professor Sekou Franklin has written about this in the book Losing Power: African Americans and Racial Polarization in Tennessee Politics. Later this hour, we'll talk with him, along with a current state representative and a voting rights advocate about African American political power in our state. But first, in the past month, Tennessee Governor Bill Lee has been in the spotlight as people have waited to see how he'll respond to a mass shooting at the Covenant Elementary School. The violence had struck close to home, taking the life of 6 victims, including a close family friend of the governor's. One of the announcements Lee made was a rare one in such a Second Amendment-friendly state. He called for gun control measures. Republican lawmakers pushed to end their legislative session early rather than take up his proposal. Lee responded within hours by saying he would force legislators to return to the Capitol for a special session. But the system he is embracing already allows violent people to hold on to their weapons. WPLN's Paige Flager is reporting on this through a partnership with ProPublica, and she joins us now. Hey, Paige.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. So walk us through Lee's proposal. What would it do, and how would it work?
So a 13-page draft of Lee's proposal lays out how this new process of separating dangerous people from their guns would function. If someone had concerns that someone was a threat to themselves or others, they could make an alert law enforcement, which could then ask the courts for what Lee is calling a temporary mental health order of protection. The gun owner would hold on to their gun, but would be required to attend a hearing within 10 days. Before appearing in court, they would undergo an assessment for suicidal or homicidal ideation. And then the court would decide whether to issue the order, which would instruct the gun owner to surrender their firearms for 180 days.
And Lee says his approach is based off of a system that already exists. Tell me more about that.
So his proposal is basically an expansion of a system that exists for domestic violence victims, which allows victims of domestic violence and stalking to indicate if their abuser has a gun and allow a court to decide whether or not the weapon must be surrendered. It's called an order of protection law. And under Lee's proposal, this process that has been in place for years now would be available to the general public beyond just family or dating relationships.
Now, on paper, this looks promising, but
Right.
You've been reporting on this system for a while now, and there are actually some flaws in it as it stands. Can you share what those are?
Yeah, so in practice, Tennessee's current gun dispossession process to protect domestic violence victims has flaws that can have really dangerous consequences. Once someone is ordered to give up their guns by the court, there's very little follow-through. The gun owner is supposed to fill out an affidavit indicating how they dispossessed, but domestic violence advocates say that that form rarely gets filed with the court.
Everything falls apart at that point. There's no follow-through with the people who don't turn in the affidavit. There's no follow-through to see if people really did dispossess. Where are the guns? Who did you give them to? Blah, blah, blah. So to expand that is not going to work.
And while other states require guns to be turned over to law enforcement, Tennessee allows someone to give their guns to a third party, like a friend or a relative. And that's the most common outcome in Tennessee when someone's ordered to dispossess, but it's a rarity in the rest of the country. There are only about a dozen states that allow this type of third-party dispossession. And those other states have a patchwork of rules that help to ensure that the weapons are safely turned over to that third party, including identifying who received the gun, bringing bringing the recipients to court to explain their responsibilities, or even holding them liable if the guns end up in the wrong hands. Tennessee hasn't adopted any of those practices, and the state doesn't even require the third party to be identified on the form.
So there's a shortcoming in the paperwork. But what about tracking the guns themselves?
So the state similarly has no mechanism to ensure that the gun is actually ever turned over to the third party at all. It's also really difficult for the court to know how many guns a person has and if they dispossessed some instead of all of their weapons. Becky Bullard works with domestic violence victims at Nashville's Office of Family Safety and says the system needs more enforcement.
So at the end of the day, firearms dispossession really relies on an honor system, which, as we know, just doesn't work. And asking for individuals who are harming their intimate partners to be honorable and truthful to the court system is really a flawed system.
And as a result, some people don't actually give up their weapons when they're ordered to, which can have really dangerous consequences.
So do we know how often people are taking advantage of these gaps in the system?
Tennessee, like most states, keeps no record of how many people are killed by guns that the perpetrator should not have had access to. But Nashville's Office of Family Safety, a division within the city government that works with these domestic violence survivors, does keep track. So their numbers can kind of provide a very limited glimpse over a couple of years into the death toll of this flawed system. And from 2018 to 2020 in Nashville, 27 people died in domestic violence shootings. The office used court records to find that roughly half of the perpetrators in domestic violence gun homicides were prohibited from having access to a weapon at the time of the shooting. They could have been barred because of a domestic violence charge, an order of protection, a felony conviction, or even their age.
This same system came under a lot of scrutiny in 2018 after Travis Reinking walked into a Nashville Waffle House and killed 4 people.
Right.
He came from Illinois, where he had been ordered to give up his guns. He gave them to his father, but one of those weapons was used in the shooting. How did that impact gun laws here?
So in the aftermath, Illinois tightened their gun dispossession process. The criminal court sentenced Reinking to life in prison without the possibility of parole, but it also sentenced his father to 18 months for letting his son have access to those weapons. So that's that third-party liability piece that I was talking about. But when lawmakers and advocates introduced a similar reform in Tennessee a year after the Waffle House shooting, it did not pass. And now advocates are really worried that the Covenant shooting may have the same outcome, just another tragedy without any meaningful reform.
Now, do we have a sense if those flaws would be fixed if Lee's proposal gets picked up during this special session?
So when we reached out for comment, Lee's office didn't address these specific problems that we're discussing with the current system, but he did state that the law could be strengthened and expanded during the legislative process. His proposal does include some improvements to the system that we have now. For example, it instructs judges to bring the gun owner back to court within 7 days if they fail to fill out the paperwork indicating that they gave up their firearms. And it requires proof of dispossession, although it doesn't indicate what evidence would actually suffice. But advocates think it doesn't go far enough, in large part because it still allows for those guns to be given to the anonymous third party.
You'll be reporting on this for WPLN and ProPublica over the next year, and are looking for people to share their stories with you. Can you tell our listeners what you're hoping to do and how they can get in touch?
Yes. So over the next year, ProPublica and WPLN News will be investigating cases in Tennessee where someone was shot or killed with a gun that the perpetrator should not have had access to. As we've been talking about, Tennessee's dispossession laws bars someone from having a gun if they're convicted of a felony or subject to an order of protection. But the laws allow some guns to slip through the cracks with these deadly consequences. So if you know someone who is affected by this issue, we want to hear from you in order to power our investigation. You can reach out to me at Paige@WPLN or check out today's episode post. There's a link to my latest ProPublica story, and there's a form at the end of that people can fill out.
We'll be talking about one of those cases on Wednesday's show. We're rebroadcasting a story that Paige reported on last year about the case of Marie Varsos, who was killed by her estranged husband with a gun he shouldn't have had access to. And of course, we look forward to having you back on the show to give us updates and share stories with us as you come across them. Paige Flager is WPLN's criminal justice reporter. As always, Paige, thanks for being here, and thank you for your reporting.
Thanks for having me.
We have to take a short break. When we come back, we'll look at how the recent expulsion and reinstatement of 2 African-American state representatives fits a pattern that goes back decades. Join the conversation by tweeting us at This Is Nashville. We'll be right back.
Funding for This Is Nashville comes from you, our listeners, and Music City Prep Clinic, Nashville-based provider for PrEP and offering comprehensive sexual health services in an environment designed to be safe, professional, and shame-free. Learn more at musiccityprep.org.
I'm Khalil A. Kulona, and this is Nashville. The state legislature has been making the headlines recently, most notably for the removal of Representatives Justin Jones and Justin J. Pearson after they were cited for violation of decorum under state house rules. The move by the Republican supermajority made global news, in part because of the optics. 2 young black lawmakers were removed, while Gloria Johnson, an older white woman, avoided expulsion by 1 vote. While the expulsions made news around the world, this kind of treatment for African Americans is unfortunately nothing new. For decades, the political power of African Americans in Tennessee has been shrinking. That is the backdrop for the expulsions of Representatives Jones and Pearson. To explore this, I'd like to introduce my next guests. Sekou Franklin is a political science professor at MTSU and co-author of the book Losing Power: African Americans and Racial Polarization in Tennessee Politics. He is joined by Representative Vincent Dixie, who represents District 54 in the State House. Professor Franklin, Representative Dixie, thanks for being here. Welcome to This Is Nashville.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
I really appreciate you both being here. So, okay, we saw national and global media. We saw that descend to Nashville and the State House when the young representatives were being expelled. A lot of folks were taken back by the optics of it and how race appeared to play a role into what happened. Sekou, in your mind, what was missing from the coverage?
Well, missing from the coverage to me was the historic role that black lawmakers had played, both in terms of publicly facing protests, but also in terms of behind the scenes in pushing back against racism, advancing bills to deal with the disadvantaged. And particularly in that story is the role of black women and older black women. And I'm thinking about in my research, some of the interviews I did with people like Barbara Cooper and Johnny Turner and Lois DeBerry. And so there's what the news kind of portrayed was an origin story of resistance for black lawmakers that supposedly started in April of 2023, but the story of how black lawmakers have both in the terms of kind of movement protests, in terms of how you legislate, but also in terms of just the ability to navigate a very tough terrain of the legislature, how they've had to do that for decades, particularly black women, but also how they've had to do that even back to the Reconstruction era when black lawmakers tried to lead a fight against anti-lynching, tried to lead a fight in favor of an anti-lynching bill. Mm-hmm. So to me, what's missing is this larger context of the role that black lawmakers have played, and also what's also missing is really a larger issue of who controls the committee process, a larger issue of, you have a solid, very strong supermajority that has a surplus or an abundant amount of voters in their districts that are not going anywhere. And so how do you then shift the political terrain given that larger context?
As I said, a lot of people were shocked by the move. How did you respond to it?
The expulsion move?
Mm-hmm.
I was sad and disappointed. I was glad that the larger community rallied behind the 2 Justins. I think that where I was a little bit disappointed in was the narrative of democracy dying was to me incomplete because it ignores other problems with democracy, like the voter restoration of formerly incarcerated persons who can't vote. We have constitutional offices in this state, Secretary of State, Comptroller General Office, and we also have an attorney general's office that had made really strong moves against democracy and really targeting, I think, from my perspective, Black voters, Black constituents, Black communities. And then I think I was hoping that this larger debate about expulsion would tie the debate directly to bills that were cooking on the stove at the time. And so while you had this national outrage around expulsions and the reinstatement of the two Justins, the legislature went about its business and passed bad bills that are disadvantaging marginalized communities and bad bills attacking civil rights. I mean, almost all the bills they wanted got passed during the period of time in which we had national attention focused on that. So I wish they would have narrated that. That would have been narrated into this discussion of democracy.
I want to get to some of the points you raised a little bit later, but let me ask you, Representative Dixie, what was going through your mind as the State House moved to expel two of your colleagues?
Is this really happening? And are they even thinking about the repercussions that this is going to cause? When it's looking at the optics of it. But also, when you have a combination of power, arrogance, and ignorance, this is what we get. And so I was like, well, maybe this has to play out. The country's going to see what we've been dealing here in Tennessee for a long time. And now everybody gets to see. We get to pull the curtain back. Everybody sees how politics work in Tennessee and what we're up against in the minority party. Not only being in the minority party as a Democrat, but being a Black lawmaker, there are certainly certain things that we can do in order to just get any legislation passed.
Well, let me ask you, what's the atmosphere like for Black lawmakers in the state legislature right now?
Right now, now the microscope is on top of them. So everybody, of course, they wasn't our friend, but now they want to be our friend. But that was too late. We know what really is behind all this. You know, when we, as a Black lawmaker, even as a Democratic lawmaker, we can't pass anything that has a fiscal note. It can't have the words gender, race, diversity, equality. Those are non-starters in this particular General Assembly. And since I've been there since 2018, it's always been a powder keg. It's always been right there, just ready to explode. With George Floyd, it was right there. And the leadership from the other side, the Republican leadership, did nothing to quell that temperature. It just kept rising. And eventually what we saw was a pop. And that's where we are now.
So the national media may have packed up and left town, but the expulsion story continues to reverberate here in Nashville and Middle Tennessee, across the state, really. In a recent story in the Washington Post, South Carolina State Representative Marvin Pendarvis said, quote, "If you look at the profile of Tennessee, it's strikingly similar to South Carolina in many ways. Similar things happen here in a way that some representatives speak to Black legislators as if we're not that equal," end quote. Representative Dixie, do you share that feeling?
Most definitely. The past 2 years, I was the chairman of the House Democratic Caucus for the entire minority party. And I never met with the speaker on a matter that was about bills. If it was something wrong. There was no communication because he felt like he didn't have to. And I felt like it was a slap in the face because he had met with my other predecessors. He's talked with them, but he didn't talk to me. And I can only think of what was the difference. Because I was the first Black chairman of the Tennessee Democratic Party in the history of Tennessee. So you're talking about over 100 years. I was the first Black. And he openly campaigned against the speaker, openly campaigned against me and interfered in our elections. But it's just tough. It's a very tough environment that we deal with in there, and it is always some racial tension going on, and we just have to navigate it, and we do the best that we can.
Professor Franklin, how does the current environment differ from what was happening just a few decades ago?
Well, it's dramatically different because you have a supermajority that has control. Basically, they have a quorum. And in that supermajority, Republicans are anchored by a strong level of extremism, political extremism. And their base voters, if you look at across the 95 counties, their base voters are solid. And we did a study for our research for our book and found out that in the decade that Republicans were marching towards a supermajority, that first decade of the 21st century, 2002, 2012, that Republicans had a net gain of 27 seats in supermajority lily white communities. That is 90% plus white communities. So many of these lawmakers that make up the supermajority are also insulated by these kind of segregated communities that are not just majority white or multiracial, but are overwhelmingly white. And a lot of the messaging that they have, they relay to their constituents is contained to those kinds of communities. So it's dramatically different, say, for example, even a decade or so ago. Frankly, it's different than even probably 10 years, 5 or 10 years ago in terms of the muscle of the supermajority, and also the level of extremism. And there's one more caveat to this that I think is important. I've been thinking through this, is that yes, the country now sees Tennessee in the same way that maybe they saw Florida or Texas. But the one difference between Tennessee versus those two states is that in Florida and Texas, the governor has an outsized influence, at least in terms of the public, has muscular outside influence. Where in Tennessee, our legislature and governor almost have inverted roles, where our legislature has almost the same kinds of publicly facing outsized influence as Governor DeSantis does in Florida or Governor Abbott does in Texas. So our legislature almost operates as a kind of a supper, or kind of they're at the top of the mountain, whereas the governor's role has been seemingly diminished. And that's not just about Bill Lee. That goes back to what the legislature did to Bill Haslam around the Medicaid expansion or the equivalent of the Medicaid expansion. So that's the difference between in Tennessee from now versus decades ago, but also Tennessee, how Tennessee is different from some of these other states.
Would you say that dynamic is in place because of the supermajority, that the legislature can then, in any way, beat their chest in the face of the governor and what the governor wants?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Tennessee has had supermajorities before from the other side, but historically in Tennessee, you've had this kind of more of a consensus between maybe conservative Democrats, some Republicans, even when Democrats had control. But absolutely, the supermajority in Tennessee, it's because of the supermajority. And if you go back to the expulsion crisis and you go back to at least part of the leaked audio that came out of the Republican caucus, then Representative Scott Cepicky more or less stated that in Tennessee, this is an argument. He said Republicans have to hold the line, because it's almost like a Civil War talk, that if Tennessee falls to quote unquote the left, or what he thinks is the left, then it's going to open up. It's going to be a gateway to the Southeast. So many of these lawmakers view this in kind of old school Civil War terms. Where if Tennessee falls, then you got a gateway to those other kind of Mid-South or Southeastern states.
If you're just tuning in, this is Nashville, and I'm your host, Khalil Ekolona. We're talking this hour about the eroding of political power of African Americans in Tennessee with State Representative Vincent Dixie and MTSU political science professor Sekou Franklin. Tweet us your comments at This Is Nashville. Now, Representative Dixie, what are the chances of a black representative introducing legislation and it being taken seriously?
It's funny that you asked that question. We were talking about that before we came in here. And what we have to do is we have to introduce our bill, but also we have to do a public pressure campaign around the bill. Right? For instance, we'll take the grocery sales tax holiday that we have here in Tennessee. Well, I introduced that in 2021 during the pandemic, because I felt like that was a way to give some relief to people who needed it the most, who were struggling. So it didn't pass because it had too much of a large fiscal note. But what the governor did, I built a campaign around it. So now we went from 2 weekends to 2 weeks, and now we're at 2 months. The goal is to show we don't need a grocery sales tax. So we have to use those type of tactics in order to get the bill across the finish line. And it's like when I first started, an elder statesman told me, he said, "Do you want your name on it or do you want it done?" And I want it done. Yeah. And so I'm okay. I don't have any pride in this. It's just, how can I help my community the best way? And when Professor Franklin was talking to me about just the mindset, and he was talking about of Scott Cepicky and the words that he used. Words have meanings and words have consequences. And to say, we got to hold on, this is the gateway, we're going to lose the Southeast. where does this mentality come from? Aren't we supposed to be here to make it a life better for our Tennesseans at best? And not just white Tennesseans, not rural Tennesseans, not urban, but all Tennesseans. And that gets lost. And it becomes when you have so much power and you don't know how to wield the power, that's the problem. You know, I think a lot of people saw in Tennessee that it's not just theatrics. Like, we don't go perform for a camera and then we go to dinner with each other. There's truly like a dislike for each other and a lack of disrespect because they don't have to. So, but now they're with the world watching. Yes, they're tipping their toes, but they're going back to their same old routines and what they've been doing.
Well, what is it like as a representative, someone who is duly elected by their constituents, by the people? You go into this institution that they just kicked out. They kicked out 2 members because of the rules of decorum. So they're talking about the honor of the institution. Yet at the institution, you're not even recognized barely for your humanity. What's it like to approach that place every day to do the work for the people that you've represented?
Well, it's one of those things like especially when you're a black person, you have to revert back to what my mother told me when I was a toddler. You know, use your words. And you have to fight with your words because words do have meanings and they have consequences. So it's very frustrating, but we're no strangers to having to work twice as hard to outsmart our colleagues to do what we need to do. That's the status quo for us, especially as black people. But yes, it just correlates to our black legislation that we have to pass. And so there's sometimes that we can reach across the aisle because they have facets of factions of people in their party that have different ideas. So we have no permanent friends and no permanent enemies, right?
Now, Professor Franklin, many are focused on the events of the Tennessee Three, but I'm curious about how the style of governance in our state, how that factors into this.
Well, yeah, there is if I can use the word use this in a very strong manner, there is an authoritarian streak that exists in Tennessee governance overall. And it's not just in the legislature, but it's in, for example, the executive, the bureaucracy. So in Tennessee, and that's why the story of the Tennessee Three is not just about the legislature. It's about institutions, so-called democratic institutions that are really failing folks. So, for example, we've had the Comptroller General's office has made a direct attack on Tennessee State University and the all-black town of Mason, Tennessee. Right now, some of the work I'm involved in outside of the academy, there is dispute in which TDOT, Tennessee Department of Transportation, is involved potentially in a land grab of black landowners in rural West Tennessee around the Ford plant. We saw a situation in which the Secretary of State's office, or Secretary of State in particular, has made 3 or 4 major attempts in the last decade to make it more difficult for people to vote, ranging from photo ID laws to voter purge to, in 2019, working with lawmakers to criminalize what's called not third party or basically voter registration efforts by civil rights groups and civic groups. So we see this kind of broader attack on democratic institutions, not just from the legislative branch, but also from the executive branch, and it underscores really the lack of democracy. There's some research actually out there. I don't think it's been updated, but one of the researchers, political science out there, said that Tennessee, out of all the 50 states, ranked the lowest in terms of democracy in the actual country. This is like a 2018 study, and significantly things have gotten worse since then. So it represents this kind of broader, what I would call an authoritarianism that exists, or a non-democracy is probably the best way to exist in various fabrics of various parts of Tennessee.
Now, I understand that in years past, there was a so-called thing called the Black Caucus Retreat. And it used to be a very, very big deal. Quickly, Professor Franklin, can you quickly tell us about that?
The Black Caucus Retreat was a place, it was a gathering space. It was a place where ideas could be crowdsourced, policy initiatives could be celebrated. And I think, one of the things in this kind of contemporary space is that historically, advocacy groups and organizing groups would, and also, African-American doctors, medical doctors, policy wonks would work in concert with lawmakers, and the Black Caucus Retreat would be the venue in which a lot of those ideas are vetted out. In fact, in some of my research, I found out that even like Lamar Alexander, when he was governor, his top, people in his office were going to the Black Caucus Retreat. And if you read through the actual reports and presentations they were kind of nervous. Like, they had to be accountable to Black lawmakers. Mm-hmm. I mean, even on the Republican side, at the Black Caucus Retreats, it was a real venue of accountability, and the kind of the decline or loss of the Black Caucus Retreats as we know them is really a major hit in terms of bringing together both the political, the elected officials and the non-elected officials around some level of cohesion.
Representative Dixie, what are the chances of the caucus that the caucus reemerges?
That is a great question that you brought up, because that has been my main focus for this past year, and I've been laser focused on it. But the one thing that we had to do first was to get the infrastructure together to make sure that we have the right setup, do we have everything politically and business-wise and the government set up so that we can make sure that we have it dot all our I's and cross all our T's. And what the other part of it is that it allows our local, state, and federal, we don't have any federal politicians yet, but to get together and we all come and have some common caucus with each other. So my goal is to by next year that we should be able to have one, a statewide one, by next year.
Okay.
That's my goal.
All right. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll examine the history of African Americans losing political power in our state and explore a way forward. You can join the conversation by tweeting us at This Is Nashville. We'll be right back. I'm Khalil Kulona, and this is Nashville. We've been talking about the ways Black political power in our state has diminished over recent decades. The expulsion of state representatives Justin Jones and Justin J. Pearson was just the most recent and visible example. And the loss of political influence extends far beyond the halls of the state capitol. My next guest knows this all too well. I'd like to welcome Jimmie Garland, Vice President of Middle Tennessee Chapter of the Tennessee State Conference of the NAACP. Jimmie, thanks for being with us today, and welcome back to This Is Nashville.
My pleasure. Thanks for the re-invite.
Thank you, sir. So you work to register voters across Middle Tennessee. What are people in rural areas telling you about how safe they feel voting?
Well, it has been reported to me that there was a person that was riding home from work one evening, and they looked out across the field and saw a cross being burned. And he asked one of my counterparts to stay on the line with him until he got home to make sure he got home safe. That is an example of some of the things that are happening out in the rural community that is going to support voter suppression, that is supporting voter suppression for the state of Tennessee. And the bottom line is it's not right. That's not American. That's not what I served my country 29 years to foster.
Cross burnings. Is all of voter registration race related, you think? Voter intimidation, pardon me. Do you think that's all race related?
Well, no, it's not really race related. It's a cultural. That's what I call it, because you have not only people of color that are terrified, you have some people that are of the majority community that are terrified as well. That's the reason why they don't go to the polls. One of the things that we're finding out in our research in the review of data is that only 10% of the voters are electing 100% of the legislators in Nashville. And as a person who actually is an elected official myself, most of the time politicians don't mind people not voting, because if you don't vote, that means that the same people that voted me in the last session will vote me in again. That only way we're going to change this is by getting people to the poll.
Now, I'm interested in seeing what else is being done to pressure people to not vote. What other tactics are being used that you've heard of?
I mean, there's a litany of things that's going on. You got people that are coming to that are being loud and boisterous. They're trying to take over the airways and stuff like that. But the bottom line is one of the main things that is happening is the fact that the people think that they don't have their vote don't count, and believe it or not, their vote do not count if they don't vote. And they also believe that no one cares about them within their area of concern. And that is one reason why we in Clarksville, we are picking up 4 counties, 3 counties other than our own, to make sure that our neighbors know that we do care. We care that they actually go to the polls. We care that they actually register to vote, but we mostly care if they actually cast a ballot for candidates of their choice.
Mm. So when you look at this situation now, as compared to when you were first involved, have things changed or have we reverted?
Things are slowly going backwards, and that's my own personal humble opinion, because we have parents complaining about teachers trying to teach their children about the state of America. Their parents don't want their kids to know what happened back in the 1800s and the 1900s and stuff. Well, I've been told that if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. Bottom line is that our teachers are being disrespected by leaders of the community, not necessarily politicians, but by the parents, to be particular. And that's one of the things that we need to do. We have legislators that are trying to make partisan positions within the county and the cities of the 95 counties of Tennessee. And there is no need for local politicians to be partisan, because we're supposed to be here to represent everybody, not just a political party.
Now, State Representative Vincent Dixie and MTSU political science professor Sekou Franklin are still with us. Thanks again, fellas, for being here. Now, Representative Dixie, have you spoken to people who are afraid to vote?
Well, now, one of the things that Mr. Garland alluded to is that we have these poll watchers now. And we've passed bills to where we can have armed poll watchers. And when you talk about are things reverting back, well, I know that Mr. Garland's being very nice saying it slowly, but I think it's going at warp speed backwards. We're in 2023, and we're talking about voter intimidation. You would think this was the 1950s or the early 60s. This is ridiculous that we're talking about this right now. And we have to stop and think, why is this happening? How can we prevent this? And I'm hoping that this movement that we now are seeing here in Tennessee will ignite people to get up, because one of the demographics we've had a hard time engaging is the 18 to 24-year-olds. And now they're on fire right now. And we have to make sure that they use that fire to get out and vote and know that they can really make a change. So I'm happy what happened. Am I a little disheartened that it had to happen at this stage in 2023? Yes. And like for instance, even me saying that I was the first Black caucus chairman in 2020, that's ridiculous. And we do so much in the state legislature to take away people's civil liberties on a regular basis. We're building more jails. We have open carry. It's like we're inviting crime into Tennessee, and we're doing nothing and say, oh, there's nothing I can do about it. We did not pass one gun law while we were here, and that was the perfect time to address it. But if we don't hold our elected officials accountable, as Mr. Garland said, we're going to continue to get the same thing.
One way to hold elected officials accountable is by voting. But, Professor Franklin, as we've seen over the past few decades, election maps have changed. Most recently here in Nashville, how have those moves really affected the Black voting base?
Oh, and significantly adversely affected it. In fact, in the voting rights community, gerrymandering, or let me say, drawing unfair maps, is just as critical of a voter suppression issue as are cross burnings, purging, voter ID laws. And the recent maps diluted the African-American vote in Nashville in the congressional district. So African-Americans no longer can form a coalition with non-African Americans to elect a candidate of their choice in Congress, which is what we were able to do for at least the last two or three decades. And so the African American vote has been significantly undermined by the most recent gerrymandering process, but also in the congressional redistricting maps that were approved last year. They went and tried to go after Representative Vincent Dixie. Unfortunately, he was able to fight that off. But if you look at those maps, they undermined black representation in Memphis, Shelby County. They lost one seat. We saw in Laverne that a new minority-majority community of Latinos and blacks were gerrymandered excessively into a district that goes 10 or 15 miles upwards in a very weird-looking shape. And talking to various folks and looking at various maps, we've saw county splits. We've seen maps that were drawn that have undermined African-American representation throughout the state. Maury County, Humboldt, Tennessee, all throughout the state. So and this is our second wave of excessive partisan gerrymandering. That is 2010 to 2011. That was another one wave, and then now another wave. And so what's gone on is that the supermajority is able to basically embed their power for a generation, even though the demographics of the state has, or at least Middle Tennessee, have changed or are changing. Yeah.
Now, Jimmie, you mentioned sometimes people feel like their vote doesn't count. Do you think these redistricting moves Professor Franklin was talking about contribute to that?
Yes, it does. But, one of the problems that I feel is more important than them doing it is that we have so many people that are on the voting rolls right now that have not voted in the last 5 elections, that if these people will go out and vote for candidates of their choice, I believe that things could be changed. A lot of what's happening in Tennessee today is because a lot of the people of Tennessee have failed to understand the power of their vote. A person that actually casts a ballot for a candidate is doing a great thing. They're doing a marvelous thing. And if they cast a ballot for a candidate that's going to really represent them, it could mount to major change in the legislature down in Nashville. As a matter of fact, up here in Clarksville, there's a politician that's already began advertising for the 2024 election. I call it advertising. He thanked the people for electing him to become their representative. That is a form of advertisement. I don't know whether it's legal or illegal. It's not matter, but they are beginning to understand the power of the Justins, the two Justins, and the Johnson lady. Even though she was not kicked out, she was part of the plot. And a lot of people look at that as a bad thing that she didn't get kicked out. I believe that was the major impact on how the nation saw Tennessee when it comes to equity, come to the power that the leadership currently possess. Because of their possession as leadership, we have tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people without Medicaid, without health care. We have a lot of people that are living on the streets because they can't afford to live inside of a building. Voter intimidation, and we got there's a lot of things that's going on that's causing the voter participation.
Professor Franklin, you want to?
Yeah, and just to add to that, with the gerrymandering and also with what Elder Garland talked about, is that one of the things that's missing from this discussion is that the number of what we call moderate Republicans has diminished significantly, and the ability to elect white Democrats who are not living in Shelby County and not living in Davidson County, those two factors have been significantly reduced in the last decade, including Democrats who represent rural lawmakers. And my last point about that is that, and we do know that in these very kind of emerging, diverse counties that made a difference in even the expulsion crisis. I think there were 2 Rutherford County lawmakers, Republicans, who decided not to expel at least one of the lawmakers. Mm-hmm. There was a Shelby County official, Republican, who decided not to expel Justin Pearson. So we do so the ability to do the work that Representative Dixie is doing is also going to depend upon the ability to make inroads in these communities and find more amenable lawmakers who may not be black. Some of them may even be Republican, but they're not necessarily anchored or dependent upon the level of political extremism that we've seen in recent years.
Representative Dixie, how does the Democratic caucus, how do they feel about some districts that, from what Professor Franklin is sharing with us and Elder Garland, that are unwinnable?
I mean, that's just the reality of it. We understand that, but it isn't all woe is me. Yeah, I don't want us to paint that picture that's woe is me. We're like 46th in voter turnout. I mean, that's pitiful. So we have a voter engagement problem. Then we have a voter getting them to the poll problem. That's the issue. If we could just get to 42, that's hundreds of thousands of votes that could swing an election. And I think that with the way they gerrymandered it, now we have representatives picking who they want to vote for them rather than the voters picking who they want to represent them. So we have to wake up and realize, okay, what's the best way to win right now? Okay, yes, they gerrymander a lot of districts, but there's some opportunity districts around here. But what we can do, if we mobilize, organize, and get people to the polls, what we can do is we can win a statewide election. You can't gerrymander a whole state. So let's start at the top and then work our way down. So there's strategy, but it has the one thing that I've worked on for the last 3 years is building coalitions, not only with the party, but with the Senate, Tennessee Senate, and to make sure that we're all working together on the same page. And because in the past, we've all worked in silos instead of working together. And that's one of the things that we're going to do as we move forward. But we have to get a statewide, we have to have a pathway for a Democratic candidate to get elected to a statewide office.
If you're just tuning in, this is Nashville, and I'm your host, Khalil Ekalona. We're talking this hour about the dismantling of black political power in Tennessee with Professor Sekou Franklin, Jimmie Garland of the Tennessee Conference of the NAACP, and State Representative Vincent Dixie. Tweet us your comments at This Is Nashville. Now, last year, we had Keita Haynes, Senior Legal Counsel for Free Hearts, on the show. She couldn't join us today, but in that episode, she talked about how mass incarceration has disproportionately affected African Americans. Let's listen to a little of what she shared.
It has completely diluted the black vote, right? Because with the correlation between voting rights and the criminal legal system, really and truly what we have done is that we have allowed the criminal legal system to decide who gets to participate in our democracy, right? Because if you have a felony conviction on your record here in the state of Tennessee, you will not be able to vote until you have successfully completed your probation, parole, supervision, whatever it is that you had. You've paid fees and fines. And Tennessee is the only state that requires you to be current on your child support. And Tennessee, right now, we are disenfranchising over 450,000 people because of a felony conviction on their record.
So she estimates that nearly over 450,000 people are not allowed to vote. That sounds like enough people to turn the political tide in a few districts. Professor Franklin, how is that impacting our communities right now?
Oh, significantly. 450, and I think the numbers now might be, since that last discussion, is 470,000 people. But you're talking about hundreds of thousands of voters, and it's particularly in these rural communities. And I paid a lot of attention to rural West communities, Hardeman County, Fayette County, Haywood County, where 1,000 votes here, 1,000 votes there could significantly sway elections. In addition to that, I would say that once a person is activated to vote, they become a habitual voter. And they tell their child to vote. They bring their kids to the polls, and they also can activate their family members. So if you have people who are from families and communities where there's a low voter turnout rate, then that impacts that has a broader impact. So this group of folks who should be able to vote, who are just as impacted persons, it's not just about them voting, but it's about people that are in their social networks. Once they're activated, then their social networks will be activated.
Now, we saw last week Montana State Representative Zoe Zafer, a trans woman, was barred from the floor by her colleagues. Jimmie, what does that tell you about the future of our democracy, where parties who hold this supermajority will banish and expel rather than engage with their political opponents?
It shows the lack of security on their part, because the bottom line is the only way that I can stay in power is by denigrating my opposition. That means that I no longer have control. America is quickly blending. Right now, if you look across Tennessee, you have a lot of the incoming residents of Tennessee are people of color, whether they're Hispanic, Asian, Black, or whatever. But any time that a person have to remain in power by intimidation or coercion, they are no longer in control except but being in the position that they were in. Again, going back to the voting, a vote matters. Every vote matters. As Representative Dixon said and Dr. Franklin, if we don't vote, we don't matter. And my position as the vice president for Middle Tennessee and as a member of the NAACP,
we're going to have to end it there. We all definitely need to vote. It's our civic duty. I want to thank my guests. Professor Sekou Franklin, political science professor at MTSU. He's also the co-author of Losing Power, African Americans and Racial Polarization in Tennessee Politics. He was joined by Jimmie Garland of the NAACP of Middle Tennessee and Representative Vincent Dixie of District 54. Thank you all so much, and thank you for tuning in this hour. This is Nashville is a production of WPLN News and Nashville Public Radio. Our episode today was produced by Steve Harouche. Our digital lead is Anna Gallegos-Cannon. Michaela Elias is our technical director. Our executive producer is Andrea Tudhope. Props to LaRange and Namir Blade for the theme music. Special thanks to Keita Haynes. Listen back at thisisnashville.org or wherever you get your podcasts. And you know the conversation doesn't end here. You can tweet us at Nashville and find us on Instagram. This is Nashville. I'm Khalil A. Colonna. We'll see you tomorrow, everybody, and be good to each other.